reviewing some pretty wild dynasty trades, answering some listener mailbag questions, and much, much more today on RotoViz Overtime. I am here and joined, as always, by Shawn Siegele. Shawn, as I say that, I am just realizing that I often do the introduction to the show and do not introduce either of us to the audience, but a lot of our audience are here, our OT community for many, many years, but my name is Colm Kelly. Co-host as always, Shawn Siegele. You can check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And I do want to give a shout out at the start, Shawn. We've mentioned it on some of the shows, but your top 50 article from just after the NFL draft, Ben mentioned it as well on Stealing Bananas, but some very positive feedback, and has been, even for myself, a great resource looking in just on the players, on scenarios where to select them, trade back, and so on in these rookie drafts. So I would highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't checked it out yet. But awesome stuff from Shawn there. Shawn, we're going to dive into a range of questions to kick things off. Some YouTube questions left as comments. Got some. These come from everywhere, Shawn. There was Twitter DMs. There was Twitter regular messages. There was emails. The audience has come through this week with a.
We embrace all of the messaging formats, or at least Colm does. I embrace very few. But
I thought Shawn was going to say
we embrace all. Show.
Yeah, I thought we were going to say we embrace all social media. We cannot make that claim, Shawn, but we do like to have the community, the questions that come in, and we're looking forward to this one. So how are you feeling, Shawn, as we get ready for another weekend? And I know for a fact that it won't be long till we're starting to say, it's only 4 weeks to week one of the NFL season. It does come around quick, but the other thing that tends to happen on weekends that I've got a lot of emails about over the last week or so, and that is RotoViz Overtime Listener Leagues. We'll be doing some FFPC Listener Leagues over the coming weeks and months, and a lot of people reaching out already. Probably now around the time that we'll start to kick off one or two of those, we'll spread them out over the course of the summer months, but usually happening at the weekends, often Saturday, Sunday, maybe even a Friday. But if you are interested in drafting with myself and Shawn and the rest of the RotoViz OT community over at the FFPC, will be mainly in the 35 Superflex contest at the moment. We will do some $125 best ball drafts over there as well. Looking forward to those. Let me know on Twitter or emailed across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. Shawn, we are going to kick things off with an interesting question from Ellie, which was talking about the kind of quarterback rankings on the website for one quarterback, where you have Daniels over Caleb Williams, and then on the other one, and two quarterbacks, you have the ranking flipped. Is that due to it being I'll leave the floor open. Is there a reason behind having it different in the two particular formats?
In this case, there is. Occasionally, if you see some disagreement in the rankings, it will be based on slightly different update days, although I do try and do them together. The other element there is just that there are players who are close and are flipped. It's a pretty good indication that I think those guys are very, very equal. One of the things we do have, obviously, are the tiers. The tiers will give you a little bit of a sense of the breaks as well, especially in something like Dynasty. We do focus on where those tier breaks are, because those are also connected to our trade values, and we really like that aspect of it. But Ellie really hits on it perfectly here, in that I do think there is a difference, a very meaningful difference between one QB and two QB, specifically with how you want to play the QBs, beyond just the different prices that you get globally on the QBs. We know, obviously, in Superflex, they're coveted. In one QB, they're borderline irrelevant, right? Except if you have a star QB scoring a ton of points, then you can still have a competitive advantage at that position. For me, Daniels has a profile where, he has the potential to be the highest scoring quarterback in fantasy. Whether or not that will happen in the first half of the 2024 season, I think is very much more up for debate. They've obviously talked about running a conservative offense. I don't think that his weapons are particularly strong yet. This is one of those situations where a QB will go from college to the NFL and have inferior guys to throw to. And we've watched that with Justin Fields and how he struggled some. We've watched that with Bryce Young and how he struggled some. We watched it with CJ Stroud, and he had absolutely no problem. And so in some cases, obviously it's going to come back and it's going to be on the QB. How are they able to elevate their receivers? You do have a deep threat guy in Terry McLaurin. We really like the new tight end who's been drafted there. Colin, we probably had at least some impact on his ADP by continually referring to him as the 2024 Sam Laporta. But for me, in one QB, if you go for Daniels and it doesn't work out or you need to start somebody else for a while in the interim, then in most cases, drafters are going to be fine. They're going to have other guys that they can fill in there. They're going to score. It's going to work for them. The other element is that when you're paying that price in a startup that is much later, if you're paying that price in a rookie draft that is sort of end of the first round, and, other than the quarterbacks, this draft is actually not that strong in the first round if you're just in a one QB league. And so, maybe it's even just in the middle of the first round. But the opportunity cost to find out what Daniels can give you is quite a bit less than if they're going 1-2 or, surprisingly to me, in some cases, or in many cases, we're actually getting them going 1-4, where Daniels is behind both Harrison and Neighbors. If you're in 2 QB and you need not just that floor, but you also perhaps are going to be betting a little bit more on the longevity. One of the things that I wrote about last year in terms of how you want to address the QB position in Superflex was this idea that people are probably overly prioritizing it. In many formats, you can start one of the top running backs in that position instead. So there are other ways that you can address it. And one of the things I just referenced recently was that in one of my leagues, a manager essentially traded Tua for CMC plus another huge piece. And, the thought there, that actually takes them down to 1 QB, but CMC is going to outscore Tua in this format. Now, he's not going to play for nearly as long, at least Tua hopes so. And so you've got some trade-off there, right? But Caleb Williams, not only does he give you a lot better floor, but I think that he's a much better bet. And anytime that we're saying, a guy's going to play for 15 years, it's like, there's a lot of projection there because the players on average don't play for nearly as long as we think. But if you're talking about somebody who is still going to be potentially at his peak in his mid-30s, I think it's much more likely to be the guy who comes in as a superior prospect, as a superior throwing prospect, and has less need to rely on the running part for his fantasy scoring than someone like Jayden Daniels. Most of the research that I have done, and we still need to actually see this play out to make any kind of definitive statement on it, but the hybrid QBs are going to be challenged as they move into their 30s to continue to score in the way that makes them so exciting in fantasy. So very different incentives really between 1 QB and 2 QB formats in Dynasty.
Yeah, very interesting answer. And the other part is with the Russian quarterbacks, again, the track record, the history just isn't there as much. And I guess we're seeing quarterbacks in general playing later and later, and with the, modern medicine, modern training and so on, like we're going to see how long the likes of Lamar Jackson hold up. We're going to, we've seen Cam Newton come true, but then finish up. We've seen Russell Wilson have his highs and then kind of, let's say, fall off. There is still debate if that is the case or not, but we're going to have a better track record over the next 10 years as to how these prospects, as we have more and more Russian quarterbacks, hold up in the long term. The next question, Shawn, comes in. We have a couple of questions here, kind of depth chart related. This comes in from OW, and it's, is Mostert not falling in ADP? He mentioned he assumed so with the Wright pick that he would fall down with the rookie coming in. He said he's been fading him a bit to try and take him later on. And the Dolphins depth chart is interesting, Shawn, because you have Jeff Wilson Jr. there, who's often not mentioned at all, but you have Achane, and then you have Mostert along with Jaylen Wright, who's coming in as a rookie. Lots of speed in that backfield, and the part I find a little bit tricky is just how it's going to be split. I feel like the two veteran guys have, and that's Achane and Mostert, have the edge there. We've seen them both struggle to stay healthy, but there's a lot of talent in that backfield, and I think the points over the course of the season are going to be spread around quite a bit. In terms of the question about Mostert's ADP, where do you think is a place where you would, are you targeting him at his current spot?
And I think this relates to a draft that we did, Colm, where we may have taken him in a spot that was, I wouldn't say aggressive, but as the question asked, maybe we will be able to get him less expensively later. So the first point is, yes, he is falling. He was around 80 pre-draft. He's now around 92. That's specifically in Underdog, where obviously we've got lots and lots of very quick reactions to pricing or moves, and then we get the pricing as a result from a huge number of drafts. I have him at 100. And so, again, exactly as the listener is saying, I think that we're going to get about another. So we've gotten about a round fall, and I think that we can expect another 2/3 to a round, or that's where I have him. Whether or not he falls to that point, I do think that little by little, you're going to see people become more and more comfortable with the idea that Jaylen Wright will be involved, that it's going to be a 3-person committee, or that at the very least by mid-season, you're going to get some of that third back in there. And the other thing, it just protects against a little bit. In order to hold a strong value in 2024, Raheem Mostert has to both stay healthy himself, and then he probably needs Achane to miss some more time. Now, it doesn't have to be quite the large chunks that he missed last year, because, I mean, Mostert isn't being drafted like a second or third round pick where his scoring level would indicate, right? So Achane playing a lot is priced in to a large extent, but if you're drafting Mostert and thinking it's going to be a huge win for you, you need that second back or probably the leading back to miss some time. The problem now is that missing some time does not fix any problems for you, or doesn't create the upside, because that work is going to go to Jaylen Wright. So you've taken away the upside scenario for Mostert, and you can't draft him as though it still exists.
The other part is, I mentioned about, age and quarterbacks and how things play out there. We have a situation here at 32 years old for Mostert, and coming off the best season of his career, but the age cliff is long. He has surpassed the age cliff, Shawn, at this point, but he had 21 total touchdowns last year, 18 on the ground, and that is going to be very, very hard to repeat in back-to-back seasons. But in terms of the ADP, you do have Jaylen Wright in the 12th, him in the 8th, and then Achane up at the end of the 2nd. So it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out, but I do think we'll see a situation where Mostert and Wright become quite close together. But where Mostert is going is in a range where over the course of the 2 rounds, you're seeing over half the picks being running back. So you could see him dropping down, but it's in a zone of a lot of quarterbacks, tight ends, and running backs where they are going. So it may not shuffle just quite as much. But thank you for that particular question. Shawn, another question that did come in around a draft, and it may even be the same draft, come in from Tanner, and he said, care to explain the fading of Gus Edwards? So it sounds like he may be a bigger Gus Edwards fan than you and Ben were in that particular draft.
Gus Edwards. The
Gus bus. The one thing with this offense in general, in Los Angeles with the Chargers, but it is Gus Edwards. Shawn, it is your boy J.K. Dobbins, Isaiah Spiller, and then we get Vidal coming in as the rookie. So, we're looking at backfields that are up for grabs. Whoever can come in here and start hot could, have a huge role for this offense. But is this offense going to be any good?
Yeah, no, I think it will be. And you're going to get a lot of running back touches. The tricky part with Edwards is just that, as has more or less always been the case, he is going to be the least, I don't want to say the least talented. He's going to be the least explosive back in that group. And one of the things I don't completely understand was the decision for Kansas City to meet with him and then re-sign CEH. And partly, we don't understand any CEH related elements as it relates to what Kansas City is doing. But that does seem to be a little bit of a red flag in terms of what Dobbins can do as well. But then with Edwards and with this committee, one of the things that we do see is that Kimani Vidal, number one, I wrote him up very positively in the top 50 rookie rankings and placed him in a tier and in a group where I thought drafters would be able to get him and encourage them to get him as often as possible. That turned out not to be the case, as his ADP was very enthusiastic for someone from Troy going that late in the reality draft. And basically what we're seeing there is that people are onto the fact that he's good, that his profile in college was really good, that he's more athletic than people realize. He's got not a star profile, but the size athleticism profile is very similar to these backs that we see come out of the SEC every year and then get a lot of, say, undeserved touches for the next 7 seasons. And everybody's like, well, they're not that great, but they played in the SEC and they break some tackles. They get kind of what's blocked, although, they don't, because they have to break tackles just to get to the spot that they already should have been. And that maybe sound like damning with faint praise, but basically the point is that there's very little separating the Chargers rookie from what a lot of bell cows in the NFL already do and get a lot of credit for. So the fact that he goes in the 6th round to me is not a huge deal. And then you look at it and it's simply a matter of what does Edwards really bring to the table, right? You look at him last season, over 200 carries. He's poor before contact. He's fine after contact, but the actual ability to make guys miss is more or less gone. He's got an evasion rate below 10%. Colm, we look at all of the players who carried even 100 times and posted an evasion rate below 10%. You have Kareem Hunt, a player there's not a lot of interest in currently. You have Ezekiel Elliott, who hilariously has
the Chargers
all of these lives. You have Joshua Kelly, who is one of the reasons that the Chargers have had to add so many different backs. And somewhat surprisingly, you have Alvin Kamara, but Alvin Kamara averaged below 4 yards per carry last season, right? And that's one of the reasons that we're also on Kendre Miller, even though, again, you're going to give some respect to the longer track record, the name that affects the coaching staff, all of those types of things. And so when we go and look at Gus Edwards and where he's being drafted, he is now going late in 10. So the 10-10. And that's not a particularly enthusiastic price on someone who probably will carry 150 times for the Chargers. Anybody who wants to take them there, I have no problem with. I actually have him in the middle of 11. So the gap between where he's going and where I have him ranked is a lot less than it usually is for that style of back. If you told me that I was going to only have a half round gap for a player who had that profile last season, where he doesn't make anybody miss and he doesn't really gain any yards, then I would be surprised. So I guess I don't think that necessarily as being a fade so much as when you're looking at the range that he is going in, and that range includes Chase Brown goes right after him. I think you have to love Chase Brown, one of the most explosive backs in the NFL and a great offense. You have Tyjae Spears, one of the most underrated backs from last season. Super weird offense. We can't give him any kind of offensive bump, obviously. But then as you continue to go through, Zach Charbonnet is in 12. I would prefer to have him. Jaylen Wright is at the end of 12. I would prefer to have him. And again, there are going to be some listeners who are saying, there's a huge difference in the number of touches that you're buying there. Gus Edwards very clearly has to get goal line carries to score. And even last year when the Baltimore Ravens had nothing at the running back position, he was constantly being supplanted by somebody else as they looked for anybody on that team who could give them, again, even what's blocked, right? Who could give them explosive plays. Unfortunately, they lose Keaton Mitchell, and losing Keaton Mitchell may have been the thing that really cost them in the playoff game against the Chiefs. Now, there were lots of other problems that they had, and Lamar Jackson didn't play particularly well, and the Chiefs' elite defense, as it kind of rose up down the stretch and became the best defense in the NFL, I mean, they did a very nice job. But if they also have to account for that speed back in Keaton Mitchell, even though, as we know, in many ways, the running back production is very fungible. It can be replicated by other players. If you have that dynamic element, it forces the defense to do something else. Again, we go back to how does it work for fantasy? It's like if they're going to give them touches, if they're going to give them touches around the goal line, that's playable. And yet, I just would in no way, shape, or form be surprised if you get to midseason and the Chargers are like, we have Kimani Vidal to give us the tough carries, but with a little bit of explosiveness, and we have J.K. Dobbins to give us the explosive carries, or they still have a player that we don't know exactly how it's going to work, because we're going to still have a lot of depth chart movement, some roster movement at the running back position. Probably gone into a little more detail than I needed to on Gus Edwards. I like him. I think that it's a cool story anytime these guys who maybe don't have the explosiveness, they have the competitiveness to stick. So we're not necessarily rooting against Gus Edwards, but probably not going out of our way to add him to fantasy teams.
Yeah, and Vidal as well. He's in the mid 14th round, and you mentioned the 10th round for Edwards. I could see positive news over the next 3 months, almost switching those ADPs around. But it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But as I mentioned, opportunities. And Shawn, who knows? J.K. Dobbins, it may all work out yet. But we're going to move into our final question around kind of depth chart related issues. And it was, how do you see the Patriots wide receiver depth chart shaking out? And Shawn, for this, I'm going to name out some of the players. So we have Kendrick, Bourne, DeMario Douglas, Jaylen, Polk, Javon Baker, who's come in, 2 rookies there back-to-back. JuJu Smith-Schuster, who I'm sure Shawn will have nice words to say about. Then we have KJ Osborn, Tyquan Thornton to kind of round out. There is more depth on the depth chart, Shawn, but I don't think we need to go any further down. What I would factor in as well when we're talking with these wide receivers, Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper are on the roster at tight end as well. But there's a lot of names that I've just mentioned out. And when Bill Belichick was the coach for a long time, it was that there was so many running backs on the roster, it was hard to decipher the backfields there. But how are you deciphering this wide receiver depth chart?
This one is a bit of an enigma. You have a team that has made a lot of positive strides, but is still in a bit of disarray, and they're looking to build out their roster depth. And I keep coming back to the fact that it was probably a huge mistake to draft Jaylen Polk. And, there's a great chance that I'll be wrong on that as well. I hope that he proves me wrong and the other doubters wrong. His profile, and one of the things too, you look at someone like a Troy Franklin, and it's not just the stats. It's the athleticism. It's the highlights. I mean, Troy Franklin was unreal last year. When they could have made an addition like that, and instead they have a Jaylen Polk, that part, I think, it throws the whole rest of the depth chart into question, because you have a guy who was drafted to do a certain thing that I don't think we can really count on. So now there's confusion. And it's interesting because last year, when you look at the numbers, and we can bring this up again using the Sports Info Solutions numbers, which are going to be a little bit different at times from the PFF numbers, but we can use the Fantastic Stealing Signals tool, which again is branded after Ben's fantastic newsletter and uses a lot of the stats that he references and emphasizes. And one of the things that we can see there is that there were some pretty encouraging target per route numbers for the young guy in DeMario Douglas. And so he's at 25% for the year. And one of the things that you note there is that as his route share went up, and for the full season, he's at around 60%. If you look at the second half of the year, you look at down the stretch, he's closer to like 75%. And so he is playing a lot, and he's able to hold that 25% number. You get 215 routes from Kendrick Bourne with the injury. He was playing a much higher route percentage. His targets per route actually higher, his yards per route higher, his yards per target higher. Again, I mean, those are the two components that become yards per route. And the other element there is that he is targeted a little bit deeper. Now, we know everything about how the Patriots do things in 2024 is going to be very, very different. But I guess my concern for Douglas is that when you are a late round draft pick who is an underneath guy, you don't have that deeper target depth, and then you're very inefficient on a per target basis, even though there are coaching problems, even though the QBs did not play well. I guess I'm not that optimistic that he is in good shape in the pecking order here, even though he was a target earner as a rookie. And Blair has some good work that he's going to have out soon, looking into some of those types of things. And again, this isn't to say sell Douglas, but it is tough. And one of the things that Ben and I did, if you've missed the shows where we drafted Drake May and then we drafted a bunch of Patriots receivers, I think that discussion is fun. You can find those in the SB shorts, the specific drafts there. But for me, Baker is probably the best of the rookies, but he's going to be deprioritized at least very slightly because he is drafted later. And then you do have some interesting names, and even in terms of like KJ Osborn, who's again not a difference maker. But I think that fact that they're going to have a lot of guys that are probably similar in talent level and also have plenty of stylistic overlap is going to make this difficult to get any kind of handle on as we go through the offseason. And then on top of that, you don't know for sure who the quarterback is going to be. My thought would be just spread around your picks on these guys very late and don't go out of your way to draft anyone. Polk is a guy who even in the third round of rookie drafts, and I had him ranked a little bit higher than that, but on teams where I needed something at receiver and he was still available, I did still tend to go in different directions just because I don't want to have a lot of exposure to that particular profile on a team that doesn't know what it's doing offensively yet. So that's kind of how I'm seeing this group. Baker is the guy if you get a better price, but for all the reasons I've mentioned, you don't necessarily get a lot better price on him than some of the other players. And so even he can be a little bit of a fade. Colm, I would mention that Peter Overzet and I selected him in our most recent Best Ball Banana Stand draft. Colm, you've done a fantastic job in setting up that feed. A lot of people are already subscribed because it was previously the RotoViz Best Ball feed. I would just throw out now that certainly it helps me. It helps Colm, helps Ben, helps all of us if you subscribe to that. If you're interested in getting those drafts, I would love for you to subscribe. If you're not interested, certainly don't want to clutter up your devices. So there's no pressure to do that, but it does help. And those drafts are very, very fun. Colm, Pete and I selected, I think is going to end up being the most explosive best ball team drafted in all of 2024. So we'll see if we can hold on to that mantle. Colm, how are you seeing this Patriots group? Anything that I said jump out to you as either like the key point that we need to grab onto or something that I'm probably getting wrong?
No, I kind of teased it a bit when I was sharing the names and I mentioned the tight ends. I think the way, if you're trying to, I would try and play this through Hunter Henry, I think is the safest way, and it could potentially then be also building on that little bit of a positional edge. He is like going right, 2 rounds ahead of Baker, for example, who you talked through. He's going in the 14th round, tight end 19. So I think that he is the way that I want to play it. There's just a lot of, I'd say, the waters can be muddy, but this water is very, very hard to see through at all. KJ Osborn being signed was kind of a little bit of a surprise that continued to, add pieces on top of it. And I really think that they don't truly have a set idea of what they want to do on this offense. And I think with the change in regime, the coaches and so on coming in, I think it's going to be, this time next year where they probably have what their identity as a wide receiver core and as a team in general is going to be. I think there's going to be a lot of pieces. If I was looking at wide receivers, Kendrick Bourne is always a little bit interesting, but I'm going to play through Hunter Henry, or else I'm probably just going to take pieces that tend to slip past ADP in certain drafts that you're going to take your shots on to have some in your portfolio. But in general, Hunter Henry is the way I want to play it. And Shawn, Hunter Henry was a way I wanted to play their offense last year, and that did work out well, although he is at this moment in time probably already 3 rounds ahead of last year's ADP, which was pretty much undrafted.
Yeah, we'll see. One of the things that I didn't mention there is that I really like Jaheim Bell. And Scott talked a lot about him. I think anybody who has gone in and looked at the statistical profiles for this past tight end class is blown away by what Bell did on a per route basis. And then he had the season with the big running back numbers as well. The question is how he'll be used. If he's more or less a fullback, then you're going to get rid of him again. But if you're talking about at the end of a dynasty draft and you're going to have some guys you cut anyway, roster him, take a look, see how they play it in the preseason. If he's out there running tight end routes, you're golden. If he's not, then you can move on to somebody else with very, very minimal damage to your roster.
So you mentioned Dynasty, Shawn. We are going to jump into some Dynasty topics and questions. I teased at the start as well some pretty cool trades that went down in some of our listeners' draft moves. And Nick sent out an email. He did message us a couple of months back, and he was asking for some advice. And he was a person who had the first, second, and third overall pick in his rookie draft in a Superflex format. So had a lot of leverage, but also had a lot of options to try and build up this team, which he describes here as an old pick to privileged orphan when he took it over. So a pretty big rebuild. But he set himself up, Shawn, in a situation, and we're just going to go through the three picks. He's just wondering on any advice or criticism that we would have had over these decisions. And I don't feel like me already having read through these and you've seen them already, it's going to be very hard to criticize them. So to run through the whole lot and then to go back, then we can review them. But the 101 drafted Caleb Williams, then traded him shortly after the draft for Drake May, Xavier Worthy, and Brian Thomas in a 2026 first. The 102 traded that pick and his 2025 first for CeeDee Lamb. And then with the 103, he did select Jaylen Daniels. So that means that with those picks, he gets Williams, trades him away, but now has two quarterbacks in May and Daniels. But always interesting when the scenarios play out that, obviously while on the clock, he may have been offered the same picks that equated to May, Worthy, Thomas in a 2026 first. But when you have the names there, then you can see what truly was received after it. So the rookie pick, Shawn, I think we'll get to second. The one I'm most interested to get your thoughts on is the 102 and the 2025 first for CeeDee Lamb, because CeeDee Lamb is at the elite end of the wide receiver scale at the moment, and somebody who you have to be extremely excited to if you have on your roster or if you can get him on your roster. But it's going to be hard to have the team, and get the 102 and, package this deal together. I think it's a phenomenal trade with the 102 and the future first to get Lamb on this roster.
And it shows just how highly Marvin Harrison is valued that you were able to make this move. Because CeeDee Lamb is pretty clearly, I think, the number one non-QB in Dynasty. And as Monty and I were trying to decide what to do with our 6th round pick in one of the rookie drafts, and you get into the round 6 and you're also staring at all the veterans who were cut. And we're trying to determine whether or not we want Brandon Cooks. And I look through his profile again. I'm just like, he's basically worthless. He didn't do enough last year to really ever start, and you wouldn't get him through the roster cut down, and no one's going to trade anything for him. And so even though he's got that name, we didn't pick him. And the funny thing about that, though, is that they also don't have anything else. CeeDee Lamb is going to have a massive target share in 2024 and could challenge a lot of receiver records with the rapport that he's demonstrated with Dak Prescott and with the offense that Mike McCarthy is calling there. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that Lamb didn't go obviously nearly as early in the reality draft back when he was selected as Marvin Harrison. And yet I believe, based on having put together quite a bit of information on these two guys, but quite a bit of information on the 2024 class and then how they compare and contrast to previous recent classes. The CeeDee Lamb was probably a better prospect too. Now, anybody who wants to push back on that, I have no problem with. I love Marvin Harrison. He's a fantastic prospect. He was in the Rookie 101 series. I mentioned that he could be the most fun receiver that we have since Calvin Johnson retired. So again, Marvin Harrison, fantastic. But with CeeDee Lamb, you're getting a player who is still young and is going to score a lot of points for you, and there are basically no questions. And so I love that. One of the things that you do look at here and wonder about a little bit is that as Nick is building this, it's like, how is this format going to work in terms of where that pick will be next year? Because if you're moving the 25 first and you end up being 1 year away from where you want it to be, then certainly there are scenarios where a year from now, you would prefer to have Marvin Harrison and have like the 102 or the 103, as opposed to having CeeDee Lamb not quite make it over the hump and then also not have a pick. Now, one of the things that Nick is almost certainly going to do is acquire some other firsts. And it may be that the first that he traded wasn't his. And so I think that is a fun one. When you look at the roster that he's built here too, after using the 103 to get Daniels, he's got Daniels, Fields, May, and Howell at the QB position. I love that. You and I have Justin Fields. Since we made the move for Justin Fields, I've maybe become a little bit more concerned that Fields has an uphill battle to start. You and I, and we covered this on a previous show, Colm. I love the headline that you gave it, where we made a big mistake as we try and do our perpetual reloading. In order to kind of fill our quarterback position, we did a couple of things that led to getting Knicks to go along with Fields and Tua. In this situation, he's got Daniels and he's got May. We don't know if May is going to play. This is one too, where it is a super flex and his 2, 3, 4 quarterbacks might not play very many snaps this year. If that happens again, you're looking at that trade where you give up the future first. Was that the right play? But from a longer term perspective, you have 3 quarterbacks who are going to be among the most dynamic in all of fantasy. And when you have those 3 guys who, over the course of a season, and then certainly on a weekly basis, when you have them in the lineup, you're probably expecting to get a 3-point advantage on your opponents in both of those slots. Regardless of the rest of your roster, those are a lot of points to pull back. Right? You think about the gap, like a 3-point gap at the running back position. When you're talking about very different names on the 2 sides of that 3-point gap. Same thing at wide receiver, et cetera, at tight end. And the tight end position, very exciting with Laporta and Sinnott. You look at the receivers now where you have Lamb, and then you have a lot of question marks. But again, the question marks are very high end. When you're talking about having JSN, you're talking about having Worthy, talking about Brian Thomas. I love this team. It has a lot of our favorite running backs too, where it's still got work to do at running back. But when you're talking about explosiveness, and this again is something that Pete and I talked about at length on the Best Ball Banana Stand, but Spears, Chase Brown, Lloyd, I'm going to throw Kendre Miller in there as well as a guy whose dynamism is probably not fully
appreciated at this point.
Exactly. That's the perfect way.
There's a lot of players on this roster that, people could be listening to this now and be like, JSN didn't work out last year, wasn't very, Worthy hasn't done anything. Jameson Williams is on this roster, had a suspension and has flashed a few times. People, may look down on it, but these assets could all be pushing themselves much, much higher in the conversation, once we get into week 3 of the NFL season, and the picture changes very quickly.
Well, Marvin Mims is on this team too, and I would make the claim that I don't believe any player in all of fantasy has a wider range of outcomes than Marvin Mims, because there's a very real chance that he is like a deep third, a distant third in the wide receiver pecking order for that team. I'm not a huge believer in Courtland Sutton, and you kind of read about the team, and it sounds like Courtland Sutton doesn't want to be there. And so I don't think that the Broncos are necessarily in the spot with their development that they have to have him either. And you think about what Mims and Franklin will be looking like from a volume perspective if they do go ahead and move him. But Sutton there, Troy Franklin, I think he's gonna score. And so there's a possibility that Mims is nothing. There's a possibility that Mims is the clear number one on this roster now that you have a real quarterback. And I mean, if that happens, it's going to be great for Knicks and it's going to be great for the Broncos. And certainly it'll be a lot of fun for Marvin Mims managers.
The other part of that as well, just going back to the CeeDee Lamb element, and Marvin Harrison's coming in, he's a young rookie coming in, 21, but he is, and this is how Lamb has been in the league for so long that I think it gets overlooked that he has just turned 25 on the 8th of April. So this is a guy who has been in the league showing that he is now at the very, very top and is 3.5 years older than Marvin Harrison coming in here right now. But the other part of it is that he has just turned 25. So if you have him this season, as you mentioned, Shawn, even if it is a case that you're 2 years, he is the type of player that you want to be making. There's lots of players, if you made this offer for, I would be saying it was completely the wrong decision. But there's there's time to, as we talk about with perpetually reload and play him for 2 seasons, move him on, restock the team. So interesting with Lamb, but I'm excited to see what he does this season. As you mentioned, there's a chance of him chasing those records down if he stays healthy. The other pick, Shawn, the Jaylen Daniels pick, is obviously pretty straightforward with the ADP. I like, when trades happen, after the draft, with him moving those players, but again, has filled out the roster in a very nice way with that. So thanks to Nick for providing that update. I thought it'd be fun for the listeners to hear some of the kind of trade scenarios that have happened in that situation. We do get a fun question in here from Matt, and he also sent in questions previously. One of them was about a $1 orphan that he took over, shared some of his thoughts on that. We give him some feedback, and he mentioned that he's really pleased with where he is his team now post-draft. But he said his only question for us is, now that he has all the wheeling and dealing and the FFPC rookie draft has passed, do we have any other hobbies that we would recommend to keep him busy until the NFL season? I'll let you go first, Shawn. Anything we can recommend here for Matt now that the draft time has gone by? And draft time is it's a hectic couple of weeks, depending on how many leagues you've got going on to keep all those irons in the fire.
Well, Colin, I was wondering what advice you were going to give. There's a lot of great stuff to do out there. I'm going to go in the direction of maybe some weirder ones, which is that last summer, when I was looking to expand in some weird directions, I tried to do some table tennis. Right. And I mean, I've played thousands of hours of ping pong with my brother and with my college tennis teammates. And I mean, I'm pretty decent. So I go to this table tennis club and they're like, no. It's like, you need to change this, and you need to change that, you need to change this. And they're basically like, if you want to practice with us, you need to get a lot better. So it's fun, and it's so good for your mind to, try some new things, to change, even if you're pretty decent at something, to figure out how to take the jump, get over the hurdle. Now, to my both chagrin and I guess what have you, the locations were far enough away, and a number of times I went and it had been canceled, and so I didn't follow through with that. So I encourage whoever to do a better job than that. Another one, Colin, that I think is kind of fun and certainly pretty niche, knife throwing. Okay. Now, as far as I've made it on that is that I do have knives.
Okay.
But I haven't thrown them yet. And so if anybody is a knife thrower,
are you waiting for the NFL season to see which running backs are not getting the goal line carries? Is that where it's going to happen?
I think I should make my own targets out there of the, who's this year Arthur Smith, and
I think that's what's actually last year's season has pushed you towards this, Shawn. I think that's what's happened.
So if there are any professional knife throwers out there and have expertise or recommendations on that, we would love to hear.
I am looking forward to this, Shawn, because I mentioned at the start about the community, but there's going to be, I bet you I'm going to get into contacted by somebody who has done something like that. Fire breathers, any of that sort of stuff, sword swallowers, hit me up.
That one seems more difficult, but again, yeah, if anybody has expertise, let us know.
So you mentioned the table tennis. I probably late last summer started to play golf. I will say that I'm very inconsistent and mainly bad. There's some nice shots sprinkled in. There's an odd par from time to time. But yeah, I played last week and it was started off very enjoyable, turned into like one of the worst hours of my entire life, and then finished off quite good. So that's what golf will do that to you. So if you want to go through all the ranges of emotion of supreme confidence to, you know, your confidence being shattered and then built up again, golf is the sport for you. Something that's kind of probably much more weird, Shawn, you know, computer games. My daughter is kind of starting to get into playing some computer games. It's got to the point now where she's like a little bit more capable of you know, following a storyline or doing the task. So we have a Nintendo Switch, and for her birthday we got Lego City, which is quite an old game but a very popular game on the Nintendo Switch. But we have been spending a lot of our evenings playing that. So if you are into computer games, find something you like and get lost in that scenario as well. But I can't give anything great. Another thing, I started bought a barbecue a couple of years ago, and I'm still, again, similar to the golf. It will, you know, when your wife's
You're
asking,
still a novice?
oh yes, starting to get a little bit better. I can now, like, you know, the one thing I wish sometimes is that I bought like just a gas, you know, barbecue. You know, when you're trying to like stoke the coals and stuff, it can
I don't
take it
think the
out.
listeners want to hear about a gas barbecue.
They do not. But the other problem is, Shawn, as we've talked about before, the opportunities for good weather here to do barbecues is not often the case in Ireland. But I've started now to do it inside a shed with the door open. So I have improved recently, but I won't be having any OT community barbecues in the near future.
Well, I think the listeners also want to know that you're not barbecuing any of your own animals.
No, that is true. On an update on the animals, Shawn, I previously had 4 chickens. A couple of them over the years had passed away. Just chickens sometimes don't live that old. I've been very fortunate that none of them have died of, like, you know, foxes or things like that. But we have, over the last couple of months, picked up a few more. We're up to 5. So we're back in the game. We're having some fun. I do have one that's over 2.5 years old. She is the remaining from the original. So yeah, Shawn will have new names to Shawn wonders sometimes when we go into the FFPC draft rooms why there's these crazy names. The teams are often originally named after my pet hens. But we will leave it there for this episode of RotoViz OT. We've had a lot of fun running through it. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. If you have any other questions, you might be watching this over on the YouTube side, you can drop them in the comments. We might use them on some upcoming shows. But that is going to do it for this episode. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And until next time, have a good one.